Today we'll be discussing an introduction to sociology. So what is sociology? Sociology is the study of society, it's the study of group and group interactions, right? Social interactions between human beings at a small scale and social interactions with larger groups. When you think about sociology from a technical standpoint, it's a scientific study of human society and social behavior, from large scale institutions and mass culture to small groups of individual interactions, as I stated before. Now, sociologists want to understand why people do things together, how people do things together, understanding that none of us live in isolation. Because as we'll talk about later on in future classes, we would never begin to understand who we are or understand our sense of self if it wasn't for interacting with others. We want to understand how interactions with others shape our behaviors, shape our understanding of self, shape our connection to community. And when you think about our interactions with others, think about the memberships that you hold. Think about the sports clubs or activities that you're engaged in. Think about the schools that you've attended. Think about the neighborhood that you live in. Think about your family and close friend groups. And we refer to those individuals oftentimes as significant others, people who have a profound impact in who you were yesterday, who you are today, and who you're going to be tomorrow. And I want you to think about how those individuals shape how you interact with others and how you interact with the social world. So the next slide, what we're going to cover, will focus on the fact that sociologists study all aspects of life at all different levels within our society. And once again, just to reiterate, when we're talking about society, we're talking about individuals who live in a specific or defined geographic area, individuals who interact with one another for their survival in many ways, and to an extent share a common culture. If you notice, common is not the same as exact same culture. Because what you're going to see throughout this class as we progress through these lectures is that although we may grow up in the same household as an individual and been socialized with a similar culture, that does not necessarily mean we're going to employ the exact same culture as we progress through life. We live within Los Angeles County. Some of us live in Wilmington, some of us live in Lomita, some of us live in Torrance or San Pedro. Are there similarities in the culture of those areas? Absolutely. But they're not identical for each and every individual. What we want to understand about culture is that it's relative to one's life experience. And what I mean by that is, as you interact with others, as you go through each stage of life, what you're going to find is that you're going to say, you know what, I like that part of this culture. You know what, I like that part of this culture. And then you're going to start to bring them together to begin to develop your sense of self, to begin to shape and help you understand the impact and the influence of culture on your life. We talked about micro level interactions, right? Immediate face-to-face interactions. I want you to think about this. If your school has, for example, a uniform policy. Now, some of us might not like uniform policies because we want that freedom of expression. And uniform policies were introduced for a variety of reasons. To have a degree of conformity, for example, to try to lessen the blow of differences in social class standing, right? Whatever the reason may be, whatever the motivation may have been to introduce school uniform policies, it certainly has an impact on your life to an extent. Going back to macro level interactions, and we're talking about large scale, as I mentioned before, global interactions. I want you to think about the impact of social media. What impact has social media had on your life if you're engaged with social media accounts? And what impact have you witnessed social media having on the lives of friends and family, those you surround yourself with? What we find in our society today is that a lot of times individuals use social media as somewhat of a measuring stick that they use to compare their lives to the lives of what they see behind the screen. And I want you to think about how that can jeopardize a person's self-confidence or a person's self-efficacy, right? In that constant comparison. We live in a world that oftentimes tells us you're not good enough. That oftentimes tells us that if you buy this material possession, you're going to find happiness. We live in a society that at times will establish unrealistic goals that a majority of the population won't be able to fulfill for a variety of reasons. And let me give you an example of this. I don't know if anyone's ever seen like these life maps or whatever that have been shared on social media and elsewhere that says by 22 years old, you have to have your bachelor's degree. By 24 years old, you have to have your master's degree. By 26 years old, you have to purchase your first home. By 32 years old, you're going to have your first kid. By 35 years old, you're going to do this. By 39 years old, you're going to do that. Based on whose measuring stick? Because the reality of the situation is that at the four-year university level, it's actually taking most students 5 to 6 years to graduate with their degree. What they don't take into consideration at times in developing these measuring sticks is that students are going to school while balancing family life. Students are going to school while balancing work life. Students are going to school based on the amount of classes that they can afford to take in any given semester. And so that may delay graduation. Then they also don't take into consideration the absolutely crazy price associated with home ownership, the cost associated with home ownership. They don't take into consideration that most individuals in our society today, especially those living in California, are probably not going to buy a home at 26 or 27. They may not even buy a home at 35 years old because of the cost of purchasing a home, the cost of maintaining a home, and then you plug in student loan debt. Then you plug in just the everyday cost of life and the fact that most Americans today are one flat tire away from not being able to pay an important utility bill. That most Americans today don't even have $1,000 in savings by the age of 30 years old. We want to understand the impact of social media. We want to understand these measuring sticks that are oftentimes employed and beginning to understand how they shape a person and how a person approaches their everyday life activities. When we talk about society, we want to understand as sociologists how humans affect society and how society affects human beings. When we think about culture, we're talking about what are your values, what are your beliefs, what are those practices or traditions that you employ in your everyday life? And culture can be as simple as the recipes that we use to make a family dish. And to be as complicated as how do we engage in relations? How do we engage in friendships with individuals? Or what is our moral foundation if we have a faith-based system that we follow? These are things that are associated with culture. Culture, as I mentioned before, can shape our behaviors. I don't know if anyone grew up in a household where anytime you want to go visit someone, there was an expectation that you were going to show the utmost respect. And that regardless of who is in that home that you are visiting for the first time or just visiting again, you are going to make sure to greet every single individual. I grew up in a family that reinforced the notion that when you go visit someone, you give everyone in that house a hug and a kiss on the cheek. I'm 38 years old today, and I'm still giving everyone a hug and a kiss on the cheek when I go visit family and close friends. It was something that was taught to me at a very early age that I continue to employ today. I want you to think about meals, as I mentioned before. Depending on your culture, depending on your family's relationship with food, right? There may be specific meals that we cook on specific holidays. For example, and it's not a law, but most individuals in the United States on Thanksgiving will make turkey and have all the sides associated with it. Does that mean that if you don't make turkey and you make something else that you're violating some type of law? Absolutely not. But in many ways, based on American culture, based on these societal norms, there's that expectation that come Thanksgiving, there's going to be a turkey on that table. In my family, on holidays, right? Tamales on Christmas, pozole on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, right? All of us have different cultures, and that is perfectly fine because it gives us an opportunity to learn from those cultures, to begin to understand the expectations for how we're supposed to live our lives, for how we're supposed to engage in the routine of life, but also gives us unique insight into how other individuals behave, how they illustrate their culture in their everyday interactions. Now, when we think about culture and we think about sociology as a whole, we want to think about what we call the sociological imagination and the sociological perspective. These are two distinctly different concepts. And when we think about the sociological imagination, it's basically an understanding that our own personal troubles, our everyday troubles that we experience, are somehow connected to larger social forces. That there are things out there that we can't control. And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. When we talk about the sociological perspective, we're talking about looking at the world from an unbiased perspective, suspending any prejudices that we have and going into new social situations as essentially a blank canvas. This idea that in going into these situations as a blank canvas, we're able to live in the moment. We're able to absorb everything that's going on around us. And we'll dig into that a little more in a little bit. So this picture on the left-hand side is C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills says that there is a connection within the sociological imagination between our personal biographies and histories and the history of the social world. That in many ways, larger social issues trickle down to impact our own personal experiences, thereby creating personal troubles. And so let me give you an example of this. The student debt bubble in the United States is growing larger and larger and larger. Colleges and universities are becoming more expensive. The Cal States are around $10,000. The UCs are north of $15,000. Private universities, depending on which one we're talking about, can be $50,000 to $60,000. But financial aid in the form of the Pell Grant offers in about the $6,000 range for free money, for grant money that doesn't need to be paid back. And students are granted loans to cover the difference. Well, loans come in at a 5.5% to 6.5% interest rate typically. And even if you pay the minimum on that loan, that interest continues to accumulate at a very rapid rate to the point that it could jeopardize a person's financial stability for 5, 10, 15 years of their life post-college graduation. Well, think about what that does. It limits a person's disposable income. It limits a person's ability to purchase a home. It limits a person's ability to purchase a car. It limits a person's ability to contribute to the economic system of the United States because they're drowning in debt. That's a larger social issue, the cost of higher education that trickles down and then adds additional stress to an individual's life. See, the sociological imagination is not saying don't take any accountability at all, but it's saying let's take a closer examination into why these personal troubles exist. Is the United States investing in our students in a way that it should? Is it beneficial to the economic system of the United States to have billions and billions and billions of dollars of student debt on the books? Imagine this. If we invested in education, if we helped alleviate the cost of higher education for families, especially for our most vulnerable families that are living in poverty and low income status. Well, first off, we can see social upward mobility. We could break that cycle of poverty. We can create opportunities for home ownership. We can create pathways for individuals to be financially independent. And all this contributes to a healthier economy. See, when we talk about the sociological imagination, yes, we're looking at larger social issues and their impact on personal troubles, but we're also looking for solutions. We're looking for a step forward so that we could address what we call these social ills. Now we go a step further with this, and we start taking this into consideration. When we talk about larger social issues, think about the impact of race and gender. Think about the impact of sexual orientation or social class or gender identity or ability versus disability. And think about what that does to a person's life experiences and life opportunities and chances at times. Larger social forces. If we live in a society that doesn't respect women, that is going to have a direct impact on a woman's life. And we see that within our society today because in many ways, it is very difficult to be a woman in the United States. Now, people will dismiss that and say, well, the United States, look at how progressive we are. Look at women's rights. Look at the progression of women since the 1970s, as if women just came on this planet 50 years ago. Women didn't gain the right to vote until 1920. We still see a very high rate of machismo, male dominance within relationships. We still see women going to work and working a second and third shift when they go home. We still see women earning 80 to 82 cents on the dollar that a white male makes in general. Latinos, 50 to 53 cents on the dollar that a white male earns. African-American women, 56 to about 58 cents on the dollar that a white male earns for doing the exact same job. Sexism, misogyny, larger social forces that trickle down to your everyday experience. And we're not even talking about sexual violence yet. And how a vast majority of women are concerned for their safety every time they leave the home. Because we live in a society that is plagued with rape culture. And we'll talk about that later on in future classes. So I hope you begin to understand the impact of sex and gender in its connection to sexism and misogyny and changing or influencing the personal troubles of women within our society. This idea that when we talk about the sociological imagination, these larger social forces that trickle down to personal troubles, and we relate that to race, to the study of race and ethnicity, we need to understand that many ethnic and racial minorities within our society today are perceived guilty until proven innocent in the court of law or in the eyes of law. Think about how many innocent and unarmed individuals, particularly African-American males between the ages of 18 to 35 years old, have had some type of negative interaction with law enforcement due to racial profiling, due to racial stereotypes. You want to take these factors into consideration because as we start to focus on how do we build trust among the community and law enforcement, Well, we have to have that discussion of community policing. We have to have that discussion of suspending prejudices and biases. We have to understand that we cannot generalize and stereotype about an entire population of individuals based on experiences with a few. Racism within our society is a large social issue that trickles down and influences personal troubles and experiences. We talk about the sociological perspective. And as I mentioned before, going in as a blank canvas, suspending any prejudices, suspending any biases, living in the moment. And what we mean by living in the moment is observe. Take in everything that's going on around you. I don't know if anyone's gone to a concert recently, but one of the behaviors that's exhibited at concerts, and I'm not judging individuals for this, that is not the point of this example, is this idea that the performer is performing. And you look at the crowd and all you see are cameras or cell phones, mostly cell phones, recording the performance. Well, first off, depending on the phone you have, when you go watch that performance later on, you're probably just going to hear this because all the background noise, right? But in addition to that, as you're watching a concert that you paid who knows how many hundreds of dollars to go to, through the lens on your cell phone, the screen on your cell phone, you're missing the environment around you, the atmosphere, the vibes of being at that concert. I want you to think about this. Talking about the sociological perspective and living in the moment. I live in the city of Montebello, right? Probably about 40 minutes away from LA Harbor College. And we have the Montebello Mall right off the 60 freeway. And sometimes I'll just go there. And I don't know if anyone knows those like massage chairs that exist at malls, and I'll just put it on. Probably not the most sanitary thing, but okay. I sit there, have my phone in my pocket, and I just people watch. Because as sociologists, we learn through the observations of other people's behaviors. And what's interesting is to see how people respond to someone who's just sitting there without a phone. It's oftentimes viewed as a violation of social norms, because how often do you see a person sitting solo on a bench or on a chair and not looking at their cell phone? In today's world, that might confuse people. At today's world, people might be thinking that you're up to something that is deviant in nature, when in reality, you're just absorbing the environment that's around you. Now, I want to skip forward to a discussion about the paradigms, right? The major theories within sociology. And we're going to start with structural functionalism, which is a macro level, large scale, global scale theory. We're going to then go to conflict theory, which is also a macro scale theory. And then we're going to look at symbolic interactionism. And structural functionalism is this idea that we have these interrelated, interconnected components of society that interact with one another for the smooth functioning of society. So I need you to visualize this with me. Visualize a box. And in that box, you write family. Then connect that box to another box and you write education. And then draw another line and create another box and write healthcare. Do it again, write criminal justice system. Do it again, write economic system. Do it again, write welfare system. Do it again, and so on and so on and so on. These are all the interconnected components of our society. And what structural functionalism says is that we need each component to do its job so that we maintain equilibrium, so that we maintain the smooth functioning of our society. And so I want you to take that in consideration, because that's quite interesting. Because think about it. Our first experience with socialization, our first experience with understanding culture is through our interactions with our family. Our family is responsible for socializing us. Our family is responsible for teaching us what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, what is right, what is wrong, right? They're responsible for teaching us how to be effective and functional members, contributing members of our society. And if the family does its job, then it passes the baton to the education system when you enter school at preschool, TK, or kindergarten. And then the education system is responsible for socializing you into the rules of society, right? Think about how in K-12 education, think about your elementary years. Line up on the yellow line with your class number. Wear a uniform at some of your schools, a degree of uniformity there. Raise your hand before you ask a question or you want to make a statement or if you need to use the bathroom. It's establishing a relationship with authority and laws or rules. But in addition to that, the idea behind schools is also to make sure that you have the skills that are necessary that will translate into adult life later on through the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Then from there, we see connections to the criminal justice system, to the healthcare system, to the economic system, to the welfare system, and so on and so forth. And this idea that if the family does its job, if the education does the job, then the criminal justice system may not necessarily be as important because individuals will follow the rules and they won't violate laws or norms. That if the education system and the family system do well, that positions a person to hopefully have a degree of financial stability in their lives, to be a financially contributing member of society, right, through the collection of taxes and home ownership via property taxes. And in addition to that, that individuals, typically who have higher incomes, have better access to quality healthcare, as opposed to poorer individuals who may not have access to consistent and quality healthcare, thereby leading us in a direction where we're going to have a healthy, contributing society that achieves equilibrium, that achieves consistency within our society. But structural functionalism says, but if there's a breakdown in any of those components, it leads to dysfunction. A breakdown in the family is inherited by the education system. An education system that exists today where 70% of students going to community colleges are not proficient in math, are not proficient in reading, are not proficient in writing. That creates additional hurdles for those students. Our education system today in many high schools, in many K through 8th institutions, are failing students. Not literally failing students in the sense of you get an F, but failing students in the sense that they are not preparing students to enter the real world. We're not teaching students the importance of financial responsibility and how to engage with financial institutions, how to save, how to invest, how to plan for retirement. We're not teaching kids at times in an effective manner the most basic of skills in reading and writing and math, because in many poor districts, for example, teachers might only be a chapter or two ahead of the students that they're trying to teach math to. And what we see is students get frustrated. I don't know, and I don't know if anyone's ever had this experience before of taking a class with a teacher that has no clue what they're teaching. Or this teacher may have an idea of what they're teaching, but they don't know how to teach it. And think about how much of a turnoff that can be. How that can jeopardize your self-confidence in that class. In the United States today, we have high schools that are known as dropout factories, where we know that if students go to that high school, they're probably not going to continue to sophomore year. If students go to that high school, they're probably never going to reach graduation. And there is plenty of evidence to suggest that a breakdown in the family and a breakdown in the education system and a student who drops out of the education system, they're more likely to have some type of interaction with the criminal justice system, and it's not going to be a positive one. Now, in sociology, we never speak in absolutes. We never say 100% of the time. But we also understand that there's a relationship. There's some type of correlation that may exist, right? And you want to keep that in mind. When we talk about failures or dysfunctions that exist within these different interconnected, interrelated components, We can do a couple of things. We can sit back and watch it burn and say, okay, we'll build once it reaches the ash stage. Or we can look at this function as something positive, as a unique opportunity to change things, right? As an opportunity to say, you know what, things weren't working the way they should. Let's adopt this approach and let's see if we can fix it from that direction. And so I want you to think about that. When you think structural functionalism, interconnected, interrelated components of society that seek to maintain stability and consistency and equilibrium. That these structures or these components are governed by what we call social facts, right? What are those rules? What are those laws? What are those values? What are those cultures? What are those customs, right? What are those religious beliefs that guide people's behaviors? And then we go a step further and we start looking at Emil Durkheim. And that's Emil on the right-hand side. And Durkheim says, let's look at our society and the type of social bonds that exist within our society from the perspective of mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity means the glue that holds society together through shared values, beliefs, customs, and traditions. When we use the term mechanical solidarity, think about pre-modern simple societies, where everyone had a specific role that they had to fulfill. And they fulfilled that role not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they felt a moral obligation, an ethical obligation to the people within their community. That they understood that it was the we versus the me. And individuals had a shared culture. Individuals understood the importance of fulfilling these roles in order to allow their community to thrive. And once again, just to reiterate, right, for quiz purposes later on, mechanical solidarity is the glue that holds society together, where individuals buy in to the vision, where individuals buy into the belief system, right? Where individuals are focused on community first. When we talk about organic solidarity is far more complex. Organic solidarity represents modern day society, where in many ways, the emotional bonds that existed to one another in mechanical solidarity don't necessarily exist in organic solidarity. Organic solidarity is not necessarily focused on the community and what's best on the community. We go from the we to the me in mechanical solidarity to the me. We go from the me to the we in mechanical solidarity to the we to the me in organic solidarity, where you become the top priority, where your interests supersede anyone else's. When you think about organic solidarity, view it as this: more transactional in nature. That you converse with individuals not because you have an emotional bond with them. You converse with individuals not because you need the sense of community in order to thrive and succeed. You converse with individuals because you need something from them. I tell my students in this way, that when we think about organic solidarity, view it from this perspective. I need you for as long as I need you. And then when I no longer need you, peace, goodbye, I'll see you next time. Think about a mechanic. Your car breaks down, you take your car to the mechanic repairs your car, you compensate the mechanic, and you say, okay, until next time. There's no emotional bond there. There's no moral obligation there to one another. It's simply transaction. So once again, just to reiterate, when we talk about mechanical solidarity, pre-modern societies, simple societies, a sense of community that's connected through emotional bonds, the glue that holds society together. When we talk about organic solidarity, there's a strong emphasis on the me. It's more transactional in nature, right? We see the breakdown of those emotional bonds and a high degree of complexity that we witness today within our social world. Then we cross over to Merton. That's Merton on the left-hand side. And Merton says, let's look at structural functionalism from what he calls a manifest and latent function. And manifest functions are essentially what are the intended consequences of an action or behavior? What do you expect is going to occur? Then we look at latent functions. What are the unintended consequences of an action or behavior? And so let me give you an example of this. When we think about higher education, right? And you go to college, why are you going to college? Well, we could say the acquisition of knowledge. We want to be prepared for our careers. We understand this is step one in our journey in life. But we can also argue that the manifest function of going to college is that you're going to enroll in a class. You're going to complete the assignments in that class. You're going to study in that class. You're going to earn a grade in that class, which is going to give you credit. You're going to use that credit towards a degree. If it's at a community college, towards a transfer degree, then you're going to use that to transfer to a four-year university, and then you're going to graduate from that four-year university. That's the manifest function. Those are the intended consequences. But what are some of the latent functions, the unintended consequences? Well, maybe they're positive. You develop a network of friends that will support you throughout your whole academic journey and perhaps even in your professional careers later on. You're going to be able to join clubs and organizations, right? At Harbor College today, we're having Taco Thursday, right? You might love tacos and you go after a stressful day in class, you get those tacos and you get that fulfillment, right? But then there's also the negative side of latent function. For every hour that you're in class, that means an hour less that you're sleeping. For every hour that you're in class, that means less time with your children. For every hour that you're in class, that means less compensation or less hours worked at your job. It adds additional stress to your life, right? We have to look at our society from the bigger picture perspective and understand that there are pros and cons to everything. And that's essentially what Merton's arguing. That anytime we engage in any type of behavior, think about what the manifest function is, the intended consequences, and think about what the cost or the unintended consequences are associated with that. Now, we now transition into conflict theory. And conflict theory is essentially a competition for limited resources. And those resources could be time, it could be money, it could be prestige, it could be influence, right? That there's always going to be a struggle. And you're going to have those at the very top who are seeking to maintain the status quo, seeking to maintain their power, and those at the very bottom who are struggling to survive. And when we think about conflict theory, think about Karl Marx. Karl Marx is the godfather of conflict theory. And if we study Karl Marx in school, you'll know that he talks about the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The bourgeoisie being the wealthy factory owners. At that time, we're talking industrial revolution here. And he talks about the proletariat being the workers. And he also says, uses the term have versus have-nots. The haves being the bourgeoisie, the have-nots being the proletariat. And what Karl Marx says is that the bourgeoisie are so focused on maintaining their power and their influence and their wealth that they seek to exploit the labor of the proletariat every chance that they have. And this gives birth to this concept of social inequality, the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and prestige amongst members of society. And Karl Marx says, look, our society, it's plagued with coercion and domination. It's plagued with conflict. That individuals, depending on what social class you fall into, are constantly competing with the other social classes, and the proletariat or the workers are always losing. See, Karl Marx says there's never going to be peace between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat because the bourgeoisie will not understand the exploitation that they are doing and how harmful it is to their workers. Or actually, they choose not to understand. That the bourgeoisie will see any type of negotiation and compromise as a loss for them and a gain for the proletariat. And that the proletariat are struggling, saying, we need additional wages, we need better health, working conditions, we need more opportunities to live a healthy lifestyle, whatever it may be. But the bourgeoisie won't give that to them. And so that there will never be peace because the proletariat have no more to give and the bourgeoisie are not willing to give anything. He says that in our society, we have what he calls winners and losers. And the winners are those who seek to maintain the status quo and keep their status and keep their resources at the expense of those who lose, the proletariat. And so you'll see this illustration on the right-hand side. And that's from the Industrial Revolution era. The bourgeoisie is trying to squeeze out every cent of labor out of the proletariat. And you'll see them doing that over a bucket. And then you see all these bodies here on the floor with no more labor to give. And so I want you to think about that. And then Karl Marx says there's something called alienation of labor that takes place. And so alienation is essentially this, that the proletariat, that the workers lose a bit of themselves every time they produce a product, and they don't gain the benefits directly, that it's being stripped away from them. And so imagine you're a carpenter and you produce a table, and that table, between your time and materials, costs $100 to make. You own your own business, so you sell that table for $1,000 and you make $900 profit. Some of that money goes to supporting your children and paying your mortgage, and some of the money goes into your business account so that you have some flexibility there and stability. Well, Marx says that's not alienation. Alienation occurs when you work for someone and it costs $100 to make that table. And then they sell that table for $1,000 and they make $900, and you don't make anything from that. And then in addition to that, it takes 2 hours to create a table. And now they're telling you, you need to make a table every hour in your 8-hour shift, which means that you're going to produce tables. They're going to sell those tables at a $900 profit times 8. That's $7,200 a day in profit that they're making. And you're not seeing a dime of it, other than your normal hourly wage. And Karl Marx says this happens in all aspects of life. That because the wealthy are at the top, they're not going to properly compensate. They're not going to properly reward their workers, but they are going to demand more and more and more sacrifice from their workers. And so that's one of the reasons why Marx says the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will never be able to reconcile their differences. Then we go a step further, and Karl Marx says the bourgeoisie have influence over every aspect of our lives. They influence the ideology. They influence the laws that are created. They run their own propaganda campaigns. And he says this occurs through false consciousness, right? That the oppressed, right, being the proletariat, begin to aspire a life that reflects that of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. That there's a constant carrot that is dangling in front of the nose of the proletariat, and they have blinders on so that they only can look straight. And occasionally they'll get a bite of that carrot and then it's move away as a way to distract them from the social ills that are occurring around them. This idea that individuals may be struggling to survive today because of unfair tax laws, because of unfair practices within the workplace that favor the owners as opposed to the workers. And as a result, because people are so distracted with social media, because people are so distracted with, I want to get the latest and the greatest designer, whatever, that they don't realize that they're losing out and they're making sacrifices the entire way. In addition to that, what we want to take into consideration when we think about this discussion on false consciousness, that individuals within the proletariat may not want to challenge the bourgeoisie because they have bought into this ideology that if I work hard enough, I could be in that position too. And why would I want to destroy a system that I hope to benefit from one day? Now we look at class consciousness, and class consciousness is a state of being woke, is a state of being aware of what's actually happening and making other people aware of it as well, right? Helping people understand that we can demand more. This is $1 billion company, but we're living off of minimum wage, which is not a livable wage. that we're being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, right? They have us working in unhealthy working conditions, right? They are exploiting our labor. They don't appreciate us. Let's demand more. Let's stand up and let's push back. And Marx says that is the only way we're going to challenge the status quo. That is the only way we're going to change society, is when people fight back. Then we look at symbolic interactionism, and symbolic interactionism in three paradigms is the only one that's a micro. And we say it's micro because it's focusing on interaction and relationships between individuals within the society. It begins to help us understand the meaning of language and the meaning of symbols, right? As we interact with one another, it helps paint a clearer picture for us. See, at times we can communicate with people, but it might not always be clear. You might intend to say one thing, but it's interpreted as a different way. Think about it. If you're sending a text message to your friends, for example, and you type it all caps, right? Some might interpret it as you're yelling at me. You're using emoji after emoji after emoji, and now it's like grumpy face emoji. Well, people might assume that you're upset with them or you're bothered by them, but that might not necessarily be your intent. It's lost in translation. Symbolic interactionism seeks to try to help us begin to understand the meanings behind the different types of languages that we speak. How we begin to associate meaning based on our experiences, based on our life experiences. And because all of us have different life experiences, it is interpreting something is relative to those experiences, meaning that we may have distinctly different interpretations based on what we have been exposed to. And so I want you to take that into consideration, right? Because that could be quite a challenge, right? We may have grown up in a family with limited resources, and we might be interacting with an individual who had all the resources at their disposal. Well, guess what? Their life experiences are significantly different. To them, $10 is just $10. For you, $10 might have a totally different meaning, right? And so you might be a bit more cautious about how you spend your money, as opposed to the individual who seems to have unlimited access to money. When we think about symbolic interactionism, it also tells us that we have what we call these life scripts, right? How we live our life, how we express ourselves, how we respond to certain social situations. And that is based on our one-on-one interactions. That is based on the socialization process of what is appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. That's related to our own experiences in relation to situations that occur. And then we think about symbols and what symbols represent. And once again, symbols are going to be defined differently. Symbols are going to be interpreted differently. And we think about symbols, look at these symbols here, the top left-hand corner, Uber, right? 10, 15 years ago, none of us would have known what that was. Now, some of you might have been very, very young. So my guess is if you were like 2 or 3 years old, yeah, you wouldn't have that understanding at that point. But imagine you're in your 30s or your 40s, and 10, 15 years ago, this appeared. You're thinking, well, this is a Pac-Man going in the opposite direction, when this is, in fact, Uber. You see the lens, right? Instagram. You see the McDonald's golden arches. Now, let's talk about multiple meanings, right? I look at McDonald's and I think about, wow, we had some really good toys in the Happy Meals when I was a kid. I remember having happiness when I would go to McDonald's because it wasn't something that was easily granted, right? We had to earn our trips to McDonald's. So usually that was associated with a really high grade point average and positive report card. So I interpret McDonald's as a reward, right, for my hard work in school. And I think about McDonald's and I think to myself, oh, I love those chicken nuggets. McDonald's, in my opinion, has the best Coca-Cola, right? I think about the Big Mac, and I know that there's a song associated with the Big Mac. I don't remember what it is about all the ingredients in it, but I have that love for it. Now, for someone who eats healthy, For an individual who may be opposed to fast food restaurants, they're looking at McDonald's saying that's the cause of obesity, that contributes to diabetes, high levels of sodium, high levels of sugar, highly processed food. See, on the one hand, one interpretation takes me back to childhood. On the other hand, another person's interpretation might lead them to say that is totally unhealthy. You look at Chili's, you look at Twitter, which is now X, right? YouTube, USC, right? I'm a proud Trojan, right? Fight on. When I see Tommy Trojan or I see USC or anything of that sort, I have that school pride. For individuals who don't like USC and they see USC, they think the university of spoiled children. Right. They may see it as a rival of some kind, especially if it's like a Stanford or a UCLA. And then you look at Chuck E. Cheese. Think about this. I don't know if Chucky's a mouse or a rat, but regardless of what he is, that's probably not the best mascot to have when you're trying to promote a food chain that caters to kids. But Chuck E. Cheese is such an iconic figure that if it was happening today, they probably would not have chosen him to be the spokes mouse or rat. But we've grown so accustomed to it that when we think about Chuck E. Cheese, we're thinking about video games, right? We think about fun. We think about childhood memories. And then for other people who, like, for example, individuals who may be very cautious about cleanliness, they're seeing the ball pits and they're thinking how filthy those are. They're seeing all the games and everyone touching all the games, and they're thinking about how filthy those surfaces are. Keep that in mind. What you also want to take into consideration that when we think about symbols, symbols can have multiple meanings because depending on the social situation, depending on the era we're in, symbols can mean two distinctly different things. And let's give you this example. Swastika. The Nazis hijacked the swastika from Hinduism and Buddhism. The Nazis hijacked the swastika and turned it into genocide and eugenics and extermination and the master race and fascism and all of that. When in reality, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the swastika talks about self-betterment. That's constant cycle in life to be a better person. I remember I was on a speaking tour about STEM education in China about 8-9 years ago. And I go to this Buddhist temple that's been there for like 1,000+ years. And I'm interacting with some individuals, and I'm overhearing their conversation as well. And they're American, they're visiting China. And the husband or the boyfriend, whoever the guy was, is telling his significant other, I didn't know the Nazis invaded China. And I'm listening to it like, what? Like, okay. And he's like, yeah, all the statues of Buddha have a swastika carved into it. I didn't know they did that. And I had to interject and say, look, the swastika has been associated with Buddhism long before the Nazis were even a thought, right? But you want to take that into consideration that based on limited knowledge, based on our tendencies to judge a book by its cover and quickly jump to conclusions, that it can jeopardize our understanding and cloud our understanding of important symbols that are related to the history of the world and the history of humans on this earth.